Now, without further ado, it is my pleasure to introduce our morning keynote speaker, Grant Snyder, Federal Chief Information Security Officer and Senior Director for Cybersecurity on the National Security Council staff. In these roles, Grant and his teams seek to improve the nation's cybersecurity in three ways: enhancing the overall defensive posture of federal and critical infrastructure cybersecurity, leveraging the expertise of the federal government, including the U.S. intelligence community, to detect and mitigate threats to federal cybersecurity, and leading an effective and efficient response to federal incidents. Before these current responsibilities, Grant has had a distinguished career in a variety of intelligence and national security related positions, including over 20 years at DIA, the last 7 as the CIO. So please join me in welcoming Grant Snyder.
Can you guys hear me? Yes, no, maybe? Chuck, thank you very much. Thank you for the introduction, and thank you all for having me here today, and B, for being here and spending a day focused on cybersecurity. Since you're here, you already understand kind of the challenges that cybersecurity brings, I think some of the opportunities that it brings. It's certainly something that I view every day from my roles inside the government. And Chuck mentioned, and I just want to touch on, I kind of have 2 jobs, or I'm dual-hatted between the Office of Management and Budget, where I'm very focused on federal cybersecurity. And I'm going to talk a little bit about federal cybersecurity and what we need to do inside the government. And then from the National Security Council staff perspective is very focused on our national cybersecurity. And we actually have 2 senior directors there. I am focused on the defensive or the homeland portfolio, so a lot of overlap with the work I do in OMB, but also then focused on critical infrastructure, broader incident response, and information sharing across both public and private entities. So what I'd like to start with a little bit this morning is our national cyber strategy, and it was great that Chuck actually quoted our national cyber strategy this morning. And who has seen it or is aware of or has maybe even read the National Cyber Strategy? Fair number of hands. So I won't walk you through the entire thing. It's only about 25 pages. If you haven't read it, I would encourage you to. It's pretty accessible. We tried to make it as accessible as possible and to really frame some of the challenges that we have in this space. And then it goes into a number of different priority actions that we think we need to take in order to really bolster the level of security across the country. And if you read, or if you've read the National Cyber Strategy, one of the first things you'll be struck with, you might be surprised that we haven't had one in 15 years. So it's been a while since we've had a codified National Cyber Strategy. We've had lots of guiding principles and lots of objectives and lots of cohesion. However, we haven't had a codified cyber strategy in 15 years. And when you read it, you're probably at first going to go, wow, where's the easy button? Where's the silver bullet? Where's the thing that makes it, this is how we're going to solve the problem? And you're not going to see that. What you are going to see in the strategy is a lot of things that look familiar, a lot of continuation of direction and work that we need to do in this space. And I think there's a couple reasons for that. One is that there's not an easy button for cybersecurity, right? Cybersecurity, and the reason we have all the conversations we do around cybersecurity is because we've become so dependent on our information technology for our personal lives and our professional lives and our businesses, that the potential consequences of a catastrophic cyber incident are literally career-ending or organizational ending, right? Your company could go away if you have a bad enough cyber incident. And so the potential consequences are so great. And the opportunities for malicious actors also continue to increase. So that's more why we're having the conversation. It's about the consequences at the same time that the threats are continuing to increase. And the other thing that when you look at it, and I mentioned you're going to see a lot of continuation of policies and objectives, you're also going to read a lot of stuff that doesn't sound terribly exciting. And I have a good friend who talks about working in cybersecurity, and his analogy, and I love it, is that working in cybersecurity is a lot like working in a brewery. So if you like beer, and maybe you do, maybe you don't, but it sounds kind of cool and sexy to work in a brewery, right? And if you've actually ever made beer or worked in a brewery, it's about cleaning shit. It's about sanitization, 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 making sure that only the good yeast critters get in and make alcohol and none of the bad bacteria gets in there and does bad things. So it's really mundane. Cybersecurity is that way. It sounds super cool. However, when it comes down to it, it's about doing the basic stuff really well every single day and then doing it again tomorrow. I've been around a lot of cyber incidents, unfortunately. They weren't my fault, I promise. But I have been involved with a whole bunch. All of them were basically intrusions that happened through a known vulnerability where a technical solution already existed for that vulnerability and a policy solution was in place and had gone through the process. So the fact that there was a policy out on most of these things, and we don't do that quickly, is clearly that our adversaries aren't having to be terribly creative. They're able to just exploit the vulnerabilities that we haven't already dealt with, the ones we already know about and have not already dealt with. And so a lot of the work we need to do is that basics and dealing with that. So if you're asking, so what's new about the National Cyber Strategy, I think the new part for me is really a shift in focus, and a shift in focus, and I think an appropriate one and a necessary one, from policy and process. And part of that is that we've needed to get policy in place, and we need to establish the processes by which we govern, if you will, and we manage and we oversee cybersecurity as a nation, and one to action and accountability. And so the strategy is very focused on what are the actions we need to take, and then also how do we hold individuals accountable to taking those actions. And accountability in this space, it's hard. I often get the question, like, when are we going to see the firings and see people's heads rolling out the door? Accountability doesn't always happen that way. It does sometimes in big, spectacular ways. However, it happens more at an individual relationship level. And that's accountability at cabinet level, the cabinet member levels, the secretary level, C-suites inside of government, but also private industry and owners and operators of critical infrastructure and manufacturers and producers of the capabilities that we're leveraging. We need to be holding everyone accountable and set some expectations that everyone is going to focus on cybersecurity because, as you know, it only takes one weak link in order to let an adversary into your system in some way, shape, or form. So our national cyber strategy is organized around 4 pillars. They're the same 4 pillars that are in the national security strategy. So there's a lot of alignment to the national security strategy that came out about 1.5 years ago. The national cyber strategy, someone's having a cyber issue someplace. Unfortunately, that's not how our incident response teams react. They keep wanting lights and sirens, but no. So the first pillar is to protect the American people, the homeland, and the American way of life. And in the cyber strategy, 3 main areas that I want to touch on in that. The first is federal cybersecurity. So again, how are we protecting the information, the data, and the services that the federal government's holding on behalf of the American people? And the services that we provide to the American people, it's their data that we're holding, and we need to protect it appropriately. We also want the federal government to serve as a model or an example of how cybersecurity can and should be done. We have, I would say certainly a fair number of resources. We spend about $90 billion a year on information technology across the federal government. We spend about $16 billion a year on cybersecurity. That's not all out of the 90. So if you look in the budget, you won't. The math doesn't quite add up because there's some non-IT cybersecurity money that we also spend. So we have resources to put towards this challenge, and we really have to, again, make sure our agencies are doing the basics really, really well. It's not always about making a new acquisition. After the Office of Personnel Management incident, and we identified that the reason that intrusion, or the source of that intrusion, I guess, was a compromised credential. So it was a compromised credential that someone was able to, an adversary was able to obtain. We don't know how they obtained the credential, but they got one. They were able to get into the system, escalate their privileges, move laterally pretty quickly thereafter. So after that, we focused very much on strong authentication and multi-factor authentication. And in fact, we knew that we had a Homeland Security presidential directive that President Bush had signed. So it was about 15 years old, or maybe 10 years old at the time, that directed the federal government to move towards multi-factor authentication on its systems. And at the point of the breach at OPM, we were at about 40% of federal employees and contractors were using multi-factor authentication to get onto federal systems. So we made a very big focus on that, and 4 months later, we were at 80%. So those of you that are sponsors and do business with the federal government, you will know in 4 months we probably didn't buy anything because the federal acquisition system doesn't work that fast. And indeed, we didn't have to buy anything to go from 40% to 80%. We just had to have management attention. Right? It was very much, we had laid the groundwork, a lot of work had already been done. People had PIV cards or in DoD CAC cards. We just had to do the work and apply a lot of management attention. And I think a lot in cybersecurity is about management attention. Second area under the first pillar is critical infrastructure. As you know, owned and operated, the vast majority of our critical infrastructure by the private industry. The federal government owns a little bit. Parts of critical infrastructure are regulated, parts of it are not regulated. However, we are all dependent on our critical infrastructure, our power, our water, our financial systems, our telecommunication systems to do our jobs, our businesses, and to live our lives, or at least live them as comfortably as we do in this country on a daily basis. So the security of those systems is absolutely just paramount. And we know that our adversaries are targeting them, because we know that our adversaries view them as a bit of a, historically at least, soft underbelly and a place to get in and be able to shut down core services that we need to deliver at the federal, state, and local level. So we are very focused on critical infrastructure. We're looking at what are the different tools and capabilities from a national standpoint that we can and should bring to bear. The federal government has national capabilities. And so where does it make sense to bring those capabilities to bear in supporting the private industry and critical infrastructure? And there are various debates on that. Information sharing is, of course, the thing we throw around a lot. That means 1,000 different things to 1,000 different people as far as what's adequate information sharing or appropriate information to even share. So we have a lot of work to do in this space. However, we also need to work with our owners and operators and our actual providers of the equipment that the owners and operators are running. And I think actually getting to the manufacturers is going to be a bigger bang for our buck from a focus standpoint across the federal government, and certainly within what we call our sector-specific agencies who have relationships with each of their sectors, and then the Department of Homeland Security, who has some overall roles on critical infrastructure. Third area that I'll touch on under Pillar 1 is combating cybercrime. The majority of malicious activity on the internet is criminal in nature. That's not going to change. I think criminals will continue to find ways to monetize the internet. We do a lot of e-commerce on the internet, and criminals are going to find ways to make money off of that. Also, and the frightful part about it to me, is that the criminal activity of today looks a lot like nation-state activity from 5 years ago. The tools are more readily available, the sophistication of those tools are more readily available, and I think the ability of the malicious actor to get access and to be successful continues to increase, and it makes the due diligence and the job of the defender that much harder. So the second pillar is promoting American prosperity. And I want to touch briefly on this from a cyber standpoint. the internet has been an economic engine for the last 20 or 25 years for our country. We need to be sure and take steps to ensure that that continues to be the case going forward. We have to be sure that our companies, Western companies from like-minded countries, are able to be successful in this space. And so I'm going to talk a little bit about supply chain after I talk about the strategy. Because that's a really important part of this pillar. The other important part of this pillar is workforce. We need a more cyber-aware workforce. And part of that is people entering STEM and more people who can, as I like to say, work in the basement and have hands on keyboards doing cybersecurity work. However, we also need our lawyers to be more cyber aware, and our CFOs to be more cyber aware, and our acquisition officials to be more cyber aware, and our CEOs to be more cyber aware. I like to say that if a CEO engages his chief information security officer and asks the question, "Are we secure yet?" the CISO has two choices: say no and get fired, or say yes and get fired next week when there's some problem in the system. Right? And the challenge is that we need a far more nuanced conversation amongst our leadership, both in government and outside of government. And we need to ask questions about, we need our CEOs asking about risk management and, looking at the National Institute of Standards and Technology's cybersecurity risk management framework and asking, what are we doing? How are we investing across identify, detect, protect, respond, and recover? What steps are you taking as an organization, or that we are taking as an organization, as opposed to, are we safe yet? Right? Because safe isn't a place we're ever going to get to in the physical world. We may feel safer, and at some points in time in cyber, you're never far away from a bad or scary neighborhood, if you will. You might feel that way in your physical space if you walk through a big city. How'd I get to this neighborhood? Well, in cyber, you're kind of always in that neighborhood, right? Because your adversary can get to you at a moment's notice. So pillar 3 is preserving peace through strength. This starts to get into what are we doing from an offensive standpoint in cybersecurity. And right before the National Cyber Strategy was released, the administration rescinded Presidential Policy Directive 20, PPD 20, which was the guiding, or the governance, if you will, for how we do in our country offensive cyber operations. And we replaced it with a far more streamlined, in my opinion, governance structure, and are very focused on those tools and capabilities and making sure departments and agencies, particularly the Department of Defense, have the tools available to them to leverage offensive cyber capabilities. I personally don't think there's an offensive cyber panacea. I do not think deterrence in a nuclear context translates well to a cyber context. I don't think Vladimir Putin is going to roll up his cyber tools and go away because we have a bigger, potentially cyber offensive tool. I just don't think that deterrence is going to operate that way. However, having cyber as an element of national power, our strategy touches on the fact that cyber is a piece of our national power. We don't just need cyber tools to respond to cyber activities from an adversary. We can use them to respond in any way to any type of activity that we so choose, right? Just like we use our kinetic tools and we use our diplomatic tools and we use our sanctions and other items, this is just another tool that we have, arrow in our quiver, if you will, to be able to be leveraged. And so we have to focus on it. It presents a tremendous opportunity for us, just like it presents tremendous opportunity for our adversary, and we've got to be sure we've got those tools in place. And the fourth pillar, advancing American influence. So while it's about advancing American influence, we also can't do this alone. We need like-minded countries. We need allies and partners to focus on cybersecurity. We need countries to have additional capacity and capability. So we have a lot of engagement. You've certainly seen a lot about our 5G international engagements right now, and working with with partners, working with allies, working with kind of the broader international community. Quite frankly, we think everyone should be making good cybersecurity decisions throughout the world. And so we are focused on how we can do capacity building, how do we and what would, you're going to talk about the Geneva Convention after this, for cyber and whether we need something along those lines, but what would cyber norms look like? And then how can we hold people accountable to those norms? As you may know, attribution is a challenge. It's always a challenge inside of cyber. It's a challenge in physical space as well. Right. If you look shortly after 9/11, we started dropping bombs in Afghanistan. Those target sets had been built for years. Right? It was just that we had an impetus and we had something we were reacting to, but we clearly weren't saying we're now dropping a bomb on the terrorist who came and blew up the Twin Towers. We were certainly going after their cells, but it wasn't a whole bunch of brand new information that came in on September 12th of that year necessarily. So that's kind of a bit of and maybe longer than I meant to go, once over of the strategy. I also want to talk a little bit about supply chain, because I think it's really relevant to the 5G world that we're talking about. And actually, I'm going to back up and talk about one thing before I go there. One of the items, and this is promoting American prosperity, and I meant to touch on, is market incentives. And so I'm very focused on, and one of the things we're very focused on is how can we incentivize the cyber behavior that we need across the nation. In private industry, we have a different set of incentives for federal agencies. Sometimes they work better than they do in other times. However, for private industry, be it critical infrastructure or be it the rest of the ecosystem in the nation, we're looking at how do we incentivize the behaviors that we need in cyberspace. I mentioned earlier that we need developers and manufacturers to be focused on cybersecurity and have it be a feature set. The challenge that I see is I don't see us in general as consumers using it as a discriminator. Right, and are we making purchasing and acquisition decisions, whether it's as a company, as an individual, as a federal government, are we making acquisition decisions and appropriately weighing the security risks or concerns and the level of security capabilities in a particular tool? And can we even do that? Right, do we even have a model to be able, I would challenge anyone to go to Best Buy and find the more secure webcam. Right? I just think it's going to be almost impossible for most of you and absolutely impossible for my mom, right, to be able to go to Best Buy and figure out which is the more secure webcam. And so we need some mechanisms in place by which we can evaluate tools, and is the camera still going to be secure tomorrow when you take it out of the box? Are you really looking at more compliance activity and how the camera was built and how it was configured, and does it have default passwords, or does it even have a hard-coded password or a password at all? There are a variety of ways I think we can look at these things. Part of that challenge, though, is I think we can develop the mechanisms, and Underwriter Laboratories and others are looking at some standards to have in this space. The question is how we incentivize people to go through the process. And if it's not going to be a discriminator, that we aren't going to in some way, shape, or form be more willing to buy the more secure tool or spend more money on it, then companies aren't going to spend the money to go through any certification schema. So very much looking for feedback on how we do market incentives, where we can focus from a federal government, because I don't believe that the free market is necessarily going to get us there in cybersecurity. At least it's not going to get us there fast enough. I guess that's my concern. And so I think big companies are going to spend because of the potential consequences. I think mid-size and smalls are going to say, yeah, it would be really, really bad, but I can't afford it. And what are the odds, right? The odds are low that I'm going to be the mid-sized company that gets had and goes out of business for this, and therefore, they're going to question making those investments. So very interested in both positive and negative market incentives that we can bring to bear. I mentioned some parts of critical infrastructure are regulated. Do we need more mandates? I think as much as from an administration standpoint focused on reducing regulation, I will tell you the 2 regs out for every one that comes in. We have way more that have gone out than have come in, so we have headspace if we need to bring a regulation in around cybersecurity, and I actually think this is a place we could do that if it makes sense. And so very interested in feedback on what are the mechanisms that make sense, what are financial incentives that we can also do to allow the ecosystem and again allow those investments that we need. Because when we talk about supply chain, and as I shift to that, it's really easy to run around and say, don't buy that, don't buy that, don't buy a car because you might get in an accident. Right? I mean, that is a way to deal with the concerns about getting in a traffic accident from a supply chain standpoint. I'm guessing most of you own cars, probably many of you drove them today or certainly earlier this week, and so not buying a car is probably not going to be much of an option. And all cars have some inherent might get in an accident today scenario. So when we talk about 5G and we run around and say don't buy from certain countries, don't buy from certain companies, that's all good. However, if 5 years from now, who are we going to be able to buy from? And so the supply part of supply chain, what suppliers are out there, how are we incentivizing, how are we creating markets available so that we have some trusted suppliers? Maybe American, maybe from one of our allies, but really a focus on having a trusted supply chain available to us so that we can make good acquisition decisions. Because if you go to Best Buy to buy the webcam and you have no choices, you're going to buy the one webcam that's there, right? And we need to pay more attention to what the security is of the items that we're bringing into our environment. And another analogy I use on the webcams is if, does anyone here have a dog? Dog owners? Shockingly low. Maybe people are tired and can't raise their hands. So if you have a dog, you may have a dog walker because most of you probably work because you're here. And I'm guessing you put some amount of due diligence into choosing your dog walker or choosing the nanny for your kids or the babysitter or whatever it may be before you give someone a key to your house or the code to your house. How secure do you feel about the codes to your house? I don't. But before you give someone a key to your house, you go through some amount of due diligence, or you hire them or get them from a service that goes through some due diligence. And they have access to your house, which is very intrusive. However, we do far less on that webcam that we install to watch the dog, and we connect to our network that has all our tax returns and all the pictures of our kids, and I would argue potentially unfettered access to a bigger part of my life is on the network than stealing my TV or a whole bunch of other, the couch or a few pictures and some china, if you will. So we've got to be sure that we're making those decisions. From a supply chain standpoint, on December 21st, which you may remember was the day of the federal shutdown, as opposed to the day that the president signed the Secure Technologies Act into law. The Secure Technologies Act actually has 3 parts. 2 of them are very focused on vulnerability assessment programs and some tasking for the Department of Homeland Security. I'm not going to talk about those. The 3rd piece was on supply chain for federal acquisition. And this is something that we had worked with Congress, recognizing that we need to do more from a federal acquisition. I mentioned we spend $90 billion on information technology. We should spend that wisely. We need to make good supply chain decisions as part of that process. And we felt we needed some additional capabilities and tools and authorities. And so we worked with Congress and were able to get a law signed, which was great. The things that this law does, and you might be thinking, well, the Department of Homeland Security issued that binding operational directive saying the government can't use Kaspersky. Isn't that good enough? And that is a tool that we've had available. However, the entire body of evidence that the Kaspersky binding operational directive was based on was unclassified. And I will tell you, we have classified information about Kaspersky as well. I won't tell you what it is, but we do have classified information. We couldn't, the lawyers were very concerned, understandably, the intelligence community very concerned, that if we based the binding operational directive on classified information, that during the sure to be, and indeed did, ensuing court battles, that information may be discoverable. And we may have to give up and lose confidentiality of the classified information. And so our ability to make supply chain decisions was often this, someone in the intelligence community might know something, but could they tell the Department of Commerce not to install it in NOAA systems? And that was a challenge, and what would you base that off of? So the supply chain legislation does a couple things for us. First of all, it creates a Federal Acquisition Security Council inside of the Office of Management and Budget. And so we have a council inside the Office of Management and Budget. The council participants are Department of Defense, the General Services Administration, Department of Homeland Security, the Director of National Intelligence, and Department of Commerce. And I think I didn't miss any. And Department of Justice, excuse me. And so those are the members of the council. Last week, OMB designated the Federal Chief Information Security Officer, yes, that's me, as the chair of the council, and we will have our first council meeting later this month. It took us a little while to get things organized after the shutdown, but the role of the council, and if you look at the legislation, it spells it out. We've got a couple we've got a lot of deliverables, some of them in the near term. But one of the key roles of the council is to establish and develop criteria for and then ultimately make recommendations about removal and exclusion orders. So these would be recommendations, and the recommendations get made to the Director of National Intelligence, the Secretary of Defense, and the Secretary of Homeland Security. And those recommendations are so that those three individuals can then issue removal and exclusion orders. And Department of Homeland Security would issue them for all of federal civilian non-national security systems, the scope of their authorities. In cybersecurity, Secretary of Defense around defense systems, and then the Director of National Intelligence around national security systems inside the intelligence community. So those three individuals can cover the waterfront from the federal government and issue removal or exclusion orders. So typically when we do things in the acquisition process, they are forward-looking as opposed to retroactive. These are things that can be retroactive. And so the council is going to work and collect information and establish criteria by which we will make these recommendations. One of the things and the reason we needed legislation is that we have protections in there so that we can leverage classified information in these decisions. And we believe that we have adequate protections in the law, that the information in the intelligence community, more importantly, is confident we've got adequate protections, that information won't get disclosed in an ensuing court case. And there will certainly be ensuing court cases as these things go forward. Indeed, Huawei has filed several court cases around the National Defense Authorization Act that said the federal government can't buy Huawei and ZTE and a couple other companies' information. And there's the NDAA, great to have that. I probably wasn't going to buy much Huawei equipment, but it's great to have it in law that we can't. The challenge with that is it's a bit of a whack-a-mole solution, right? To just every year figure out what companies you want to name in legislation, and we know how legislation moves in this town. It's not quite a guarantee. And so that's not the way we want to deal with this. We wanted to have a systemic process, which we now have in the council. And so the council will be able to leverage classified information for making those recommendations. We actually have to create rules and publicly go through the entire rules process for the work that we're going to do. There are judicial review provisions inside of the legislation, so this is challengeable. The decisions, the recommendations are challengeable, or the orders are challengeable, both from a merit standpoint and from a constitutionality standpoint, and we still think that we've got provisions. So we think it's certainly fair from a business standpoint, but something that we can leverage from the government to really then be able to protect the systems and understand what type of equipment's coming into our ecosystem. So Excited about the legislation. Again, we will have our first meeting later this month. We have a lot of kind of administrative work that we need to do to figure out how the council is going to operate before. I wouldn't expect a removal or exclusion order to come flying out anytime in the really near term, but it is something we're very, very focused on. So I would like to now shift to taking questions if anyone's got something that you wish I had talked about or different. Sean, and I think we've got microphones coming.
Hi, Sean Lingus with Cybersecurity. Thanks for being here, Grant. Wanted to ask you, you talked about the revocation of PPD 20. I just wanted to ask if it's already paying dividends in your mind, if there are tangible examples that, I mean, obviously you can't talk about them, but it's been several months. Are you guys using the new authorities, and how much quicker is it than it was before?
So yes, maybe I should just stop there. So I do think it's paying dividends operationally. So I think we've had operational success. From a streamlined standpoint, it is definitely a lot more streamlined. And in the decision making, I think it still has all the protections we need in place around deciding to implement an offensive operation in some way, shape, or form. So I think we've got the opportunity for the interagency to weigh in, to express any concerns, to do deconfliction, but it definitely is much, much quicker than what we had before, and gives more authority to the people who need to actually make those decisions and let them do some of the deconfliction process. Other questions? Sir, she's coming.
Thanks, Grant. Jason Miller, Federal News Network. You mentioned the federal cybersecurity piece, and I'm interested to know from your perspective at the Federal CISO Council, but also from NSC, this idea of zero trust keeps coming up. This idea of we got to move to zero trust, and when you bring up the OPM breach and moving 40% to 80% for two-factor authentication, HSPD 12, yada yada yada, how much does that set the if you will, the path forward to getting to a zero trust framework, a zero trust umbrella? Can you just kind of give some thoughts?
Yeah. So moving to zero trust is absolutely where we need to go, and this is something that I think we've known for years. 10 years ago, when I was at DIA, I used to talk about the fact that the way we protected things is that we put them on a different network, right? And that's very much, once you were in that network, you were free to go anywhere inside that network. And so if you needed things at a particular level, you were in NSA network. And if you needed them at a different level, you were inside a JWIX or SIPRnet or NIPR. We've had to shift, and we haven't done it quickly enough, to where the data is actually protecting itself, right? That the data has a level of awareness, if you will, to who it should or should not reveal itself to, and when and where it should or should not reveal itself, right? And we've got to get to where we've got a much more granular level of control over the data, and to presume people are going to get into our systems, right? You're never going to build a giant wall and keep everyone out. So when they do, how have you segmented your information and your networks? How do you ensure that you're minimizing the consequences of someone getting in? And that's really, to me, what zero trust is about. The tools and technologies are certainly out there and available. I think the challenge is going to be around the business rules, right? And so, technologists can do a lot of cool things if someone can tell us, well, who's actually supposed to have access to this? And in the intelligence community after 9/11, we had a big shift from need to know to need to share. And so how did you share that information? And where do you put business boundaries around it? And I think that's going to be a challenge. I mean, in the Snowden leaks, Edward Snowden's job was like a data aggregator. I mean, people called him up and said, hey, dude, you're crushing my system by downloading all the data out of it. Please stop. And he said, oh, I'll do that in the middle of the night. And they said, oh, thank you. That'd be great. Download all my data at the middle of the night. That'll be better for me, right? And so, he was in the perfect position because his job was to aggregate all this data. And so the business rules around who should and should not, if you will, have access to data and information is going to be a challenge as we move to zero trust. and it's something we have to solve, right? We need to understand our data is, people call it the oil of the internet, whatever analogy you'd like to use. It is where our value is at as organizations, as a government, and we've got to have ways to protect it. And we need to understand it better and get more fidelity around it. That said, we still have to do the sharing appropriately, certainly from a government standpoint. Sir?
Al Munson, Potomac Institute. There's a body of thought that says so long as we are executing so much of our IT processes on von Neumann computers with executables and data in kind of shared memory, that we've got an inherent vulnerability there, and that perhaps we really are going to need to have some hardware features specifically installed in processor chips if we're ever going to be able to really build very strong strong defenses. Are you folks interacting at all on that issue?
So I would say a little bit, and in the strategy, I would sort of put that into some of the R&D work that needs to be done. And we certainly have a little bit in the strategy on R&D around cybersecurity and where we need to get to in the future. I think you're talking about emerging technologies and AI and quantum on a panel later this afternoon. And those are all areas where I think as those capabilities, offensive and defensive, or malicious and defensive, however you'd like to look at it, continue to grow, we're going to have to get better and better. From a defensive standpoint right now, I'm more focused on there are much easier ways for adversaries to get into all our systems, and let's focus on making sure we make it harder and harder. But as we make it harder, as we get better at patching our systems and doing updates and upgrades, and I think in general, software industry has gotten better. They are far more focused on this. Those types of challenges, we're going to need solutions that drive us into, what is really secure about this box or this device that I'm carrying around with me. So I would say probably a little less focused on it than some of the more immediate, but certainly an eye towards, and I think it's an area where probably industry is going to have more lead than government on that space. Other questions?
Matashek with Politico. Two quick questions for you. To your comments about cybersecurity throughout the government as a whole, how worried are you that Secretary Nielsen's departure is going to hurt DHS's cybersecurity mission? And then recently we wrote a story about a survey of the OFCIO that found only 19% of employees are satisfied with their work. There's a lot of confusion about workflows and things like that. How do you handle that, or can that be corrected? Thanks.
So on the first question about Secretary Nielsen, I think, my personal opinion, there's a really solid team inside of the Department of Homeland Security. Folks in place. Chris Krebs is the director of CISA, Cybersecurity and Infrastructure Security Agency. So I think they've got a solid team there that will be able to continue the work. We've had transitioned through a number of different secretaries, and those are changes that are going to naturally occur. I think their ability, the fact that we've got the National Cyber Strategy, DHS put their DHS cyber strategy out last summer. I think they've got some good guideposts that the department can continue to work off of. So I'm not actually concerned that the level of focus inside the department, certainly different secretaries focus more naturally in one area or another, but I'm not worried about what it's going to mean from a overall federal standpoint or national security standpoint. I saw the article on OFCIO. I don't necessarily agree with it necessarily. You had a conversation with one disgruntled employee. I would say there has been some confusion, but I think from a management standpoint, it's really about getting the team together. It's a relatively small team, and maintaining the focus on the important work and the opportunities that we have in front of us. And those really are, how do we help inside of, from an OMB standpoint, how do we help departments and agencies enhance their cybersecurity capabilities, enhance their information technology delivery, and really deliver the services that citizens and Americans expect and deserve, and do that in a way that's fully protected and fully secure. So I think we've got an exciting mission. I think it's a great place to work, so we are focused on that. Yeah, let me go all the way in the back.
Dr. Watchman from Mantech, University of Maryland, Quantum Security Alliance. My question is simple. In 2015, there was a joint task force that was instantiated to figure out the impact of the lack of cyber awareness and how it impacted resiliency. In the last 2.5 years, Dr. Ron Ross, in that joint task force role, has issued over 117 updated NIST guidelines specifically articulating the need to be cyber aware at the executive level as it applies to resiliency. With the Rev 5 of the NIST 853 coming out and it's evidentiary based, how do you see resiliency being resolved as it applies to supply chain when you begin to consider that Zero Trust says you don't have to do any of the above?
I'm not sure it's a simple question. So I would say, and if I understand your question correctly, what do we need to do to be sure we've got our leadership focused on resilience and the steps that we need to take going forward? And this is kind of, there's lots of standards and lots of guidance out there and lots of policy. To me, cybersecurity is less about what's the next policy that we get out there, and I'm a policy guy, so my tool is policy. And it's as much about how we get implementation of that policy. How do we get uptake? How do we focus at the in the federal space, or in any space, I guess, at the leadership level, to have leadership awareness and then have them taking actions. And a lot of that is education. It's K through 12 education for the future. It's near-term education, and then it's that management attention. And so, for me, having the president come out with a national cyber strategy, having executive orders, and having other items that we're driving forward continue to help raise the bar and raise that awareness. But I think a lot of it is going to just be hard work, because the number of people that have read the 100 and whatever NIST updated pubs that have come out is relatively small, and they're not always. I mean, we need those people to read them, but we really need people who are going to communicate with the people that are going to ensure their implementation. So we've got time for a couple more. We'll do one.
Hi, Grant. Chris Bing, Reuters. Just two quick questions. The first one, so one of the other roles that you have is leading the Vulnerabilities Equities Process Board. And I wanted to check in on, since the charter had come out, what that process had been like, how many times maybe the board has met, and whether there's going to be, I know there had been some mention in the charter about some more public information coming out on decisions that were made. If you could talk about that a little bit, what your experience has been. And then the second question, recently, the Trump administration designated the IRGC as a terrorist organization. Given the Iranians as a very prominent cyber actor, have you seen in your government role a reaction from them in cyberspace? And were there defensive maneuvers that were taken to kind of prepare for that designation? Thank you.
So I'll touch on the second one, but I'm not going to talk much on it. Yes, there were defensive things put in place and conversations that put in place, and I'm not going to comment on what we have or haven't actually seen from them. On the vulnerabilities equities process, if you're not aware, basically when the US government identifies a vulnerability that we want to exploit from an offensive standpoint, we go through a process and assess what the risk of, should we disclose that vulnerability or should we keep it as a secret, if you will, and use it to exploit. And I chair the board that goes through that review. It's actually a good, healthy, dynamic conversation. I will say that some of I mentioned earlier, software companies, in my opinion, are getting better at finding their own vulnerabilities, at having bug bounty programs, at having vulnerability disclosure programs. And one of the things I think we've seen a shift in is we used to identify, this is not new that the government has identified vulnerabilities and told industry about them. And I think we used to find more of them because we used to serve to a degree as kind of the quality assurance in cybersecurity for a lot of industry. We are seeing less and less of a need of that, and we are far more focused now on looking for vulnerabilities to achieve a particular outcome. And so I would say the nature of the work inside the federal government's changed. However, all of those continue to go through the board process, and still a percentage of those get disclosed, a percentage of those get kept internally. And I think we have one or two. Yeah.
Tony Juarez with Northrop Grumman. Is the federal government looking to adopt and create policy to regulate blockchain technology to enhance supply chain management?
I'm not. So I won't say the federal government's not, because there could be someone focused on this. Blockchain is certainly something we're looking at. However, I have not heard anything about us focused from a regulatory standpoint around blockchain.
So this may be outside your purview a bit, but I was wondering about the security clearance process and how that could be improved. I read that OPM might be sunset next year, and the security clearance function moving to DoD. Is there planning underway to make the resources adequate to handle improved clearance process for non-DoD agencies? And a related question, there is a lot of talent out there in cybersecurity in the private sector that is intimidated and maybe doesn't want to come to government because of the cumbersome clearance process. Is there some thought to given to bring some of these very talented individuals into the pool?
Yeah, so security clearance is outside my realm. I will say, yes, there's have been a number of looks and continue to be some. I should have you answer, John. A number of focuses around how that process works and how we can shift some of those processes. The intent is that that work is going to move from OPM over to the Department of Defense, and so we are working to be sure that that is done in a streamlined fashion. And there's I would say, a very big focus from all of those teams on timelines and how do we make that a less cumbersome or a more streamlined process. And I think I have time for one more, or no? Chuck's standing, so
That one turn on? There we go. Okay. So I'm going to do the prerogative of the chair and ask one more.
Okay.
And then we'll close. I read somewhere that South Korea is about to turn on 5G nationwide. Okay. It seems to me that that us here at home and our European partners are still wringing our hands over supply chain related issues, and sky is falling. We can't buy Huawei and so forth. So the question would be, how did the South Koreans do it? How have they managed the risk associated with it, and what lessons learned might there be for us there?
So I think. So I don't have intimate knowledge on sort of how they're managing their risk. We are talking with them and encouraging them to manage their risk as much as possible. Seoul's one of the most connected cities in the world. If you take South Korea and you overlay it on the United States, I don't know what state it's going to look like, but it's going to be small. So I think they have some advantages from a geography standpoint, because one of the challenges of 5G is the need to have many, many more cell towers, right? Many more access points. They need to be closer together in order to get to 5G. And I would say that in my conversations with industry, 5G rollout in the United States is driven by industry, right? It's not driven by the federal government. It's not a nationalized system. We're not looking to have a nationalized system in any way, shape, or form. It is an industry driven, and when I talk to our big telecom providers, they are moving out. They are creating pilots. They are setting those up. They are driving in that direction. There are things the federal government can do to help, and we want to be sure that companies are making the right decisions around cybersecurity, and that security is a really important part of that rollout. And I think we've been very successful, at the very least, if the bar is ensuring we have awareness as we move towards 5G and awareness around cybersecurity, I think we've been very successful in getting there. So I think that our companies are going to be able to roll this out. I think we've got supply chain challenges. I think we've got near-term and long-term supply chain challenges that we need to be focused on. I don't view that as slowing the pace inside the country of accelerating 5G. Thank you all very much for having me today. I wish I could stay for the whole day, but I can't. I appreciate the dialogue and continue to welcome feedback.